Hi folks, we're back for another top 10 riffs. This time we're going to look at the Stratocaster. Hey folks, it's Jack here from Peach Guitars and welcome to another top 10 riffs. We set this little series off recently with the top 10 Les Paul riffs of all time, and that video proved to be very popular. We had loads of comments, loads of different opinions on what should and shouldn't have been in that list. And to further that debate, we thought it's only fair to extend the same treatment to arguably the more iconic electric guitar design of all time, the Fender Stratocaster. This is certainly a guitar that I would say most people who aren't guitar fanatics know more about. This is a more instantly recognizable guitar. Now, before we delve into the list, let me first define what I mean by the term riff. To me anyway, I wanted to choose some riffs for this list that maybe weren't so obvious. They weren't the go-to signature Stratocaster tones that everyone refers to, everyone knows about. I wanted to throw in a few little curveballs here and there. There'll be some things that maybe you didn't expect, and there'll certainly be some omissions that you might have expected to see. But whatever your thoughts are, let me know down in the comments what you thought should or shouldn't have made this list. So without further ado, let's delve into the top 10 Strat riffs of all time. So by this point in 2021, this is definitely the riff that when you play it in a guitar store, everyone gets a little bit on edge and a little bit upset. But that's just because it's one of the most iconic riffs of the 21st century for sure. John Mayer at his absolute songwriting best with this real cool ballad. It shows off just what a great Strat in between position tone is all about, with tons of reverb on the amp and a beautiful clean tone. So one of the most important Strat players of the last few decades at least is John Frusciante of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. It's very difficult to pick just one riff of his. He's an absolute rhythmic master when it comes to that R&B infused Strat style. And this is one of the hardest riffs that I think he's ever played, and certainly one of the hardest things I've ever tried to play. It took many, many attempts, didn't quite nail it, but you're going to see from this clip just how difficult this riff is to nail perfectly, and that's why it's more than worthy of its place on this list. So here's a riff that a lot of people were asking to see in our top 10 Les Paul riffs of all time. Lo and behold though, we soon found out after that it was actually recorded on a Strat. As Joe Perry liked to do, he bundled around a bunch of different guitars in the studio to get different textures. And once I played this riff on the bridge pickup of a Strat, it all made sense once again. So it's a real classic, it's a timeless riff, and it suits a Stratocaster down to the ground. So one of the truly unsung kings of the Stratocaster of all time is the great Nile Rodgers, and he's penned so many classic tunes with the guitar right at the forefront. He was really the guy who I think kept the Strat tone alive throughout the course of 70s and 80s popular music. Very hard to pick just one of his great riffs, but this is undoubtedly the one that most guitar players will recognize and love to play. So here's a riff by a man who just had to be on this list at least once, and I did my very best. I'm a little rusty on these licks, but it's always great to see and hear just how different people interpret these riffs. So it's my best shot at Mr. Stevie Ray Vaughan's take. Obviously I asked John to do it, but he declined. So here we are with what I consider to be Stevie's best and most powerful and most persistent riff. Now here's one that maybe not everyone would have assumed might be on this list, but it struck all of us here at Peach Guitars when we were putting this list together as being an obvious choice. It's such a signature sound, not necessarily a signature Stratocaster sound to most people, but the Edge has such a unique tone, and his Strat is really such a large part of this formula that maybe not everybody appreciates and understands enough. However, I think it's more than worthy of this place on the top 10. Now this riff to me really cements what a Strat is all about, using that second position and getting that signature Strat quack. The guys in Lynyrd Skynyrd penned this riff back in the 70s, and it's another absolute classic that I actually realised I've been playing wrong for my entire life until sitting down to learn it properly for this video. So enjoy. So here's a riff that we all knew had to have its place on the top 10. It's one of the most iconic Strat riffs of all time, and actually came about just as Clapton was transitioning to the Strat. He was mostly known up to that point as a Gibson player, but this album, the Derek and the Dominoes album, really cemented his work on the Stratocaster as being absolutely legendary. It gave birth to pretty much the tones that he used for the rest of his career, but were never bettered by a small pig nose amp on this fantastic record, obviously with Duane Allman playing the second guitar part, but that main riff is why we're all here. Okay, so we're right in the thick of it now. We're right up at number 2. Very, very hard decision making at this point, but I'm going to say number 2 just misses out on the top spot, despite being by arguably the most iconic, most important and most famous Strat player of all time. This is definitely a riff that inspired legions of guitar players and continues to this day, and yet it's very hard to actually accurately replicate all the little nuances and facets of any of his riffs, but this one in particular, I think, shows just what a fantastically outstanding musician he was, and his understanding of harmony and complexity and all this stuff just placed in one riff. This is one of the best examples of a guitar riff of all time, let alone a Strat. So here we are, Mr. Jimi Hendrix with Purple Haze. So folks, we've nearly made it to the end of the list, the ultimate riff, but before we do, there are several honourable mentions that I'd like to throw in here. So without further ado, let's look at some of the riffs that are equally fantastic but just didn't quite make it in the top 10. Now arguably the most famous and most important Stratocaster player of all time is Mr. Jimi Hendrix. Now for this list, I think he's kind of the equivalent here as Jimmy Page was on our top 10 Les Paul riffs. It's impossible to pick just one, so there's several honourable mentions here that are our definite favourites, and I wanted to include all of them, so here we go. So it was definitely fitting to include some of the great Rory Gallagher's musical contributions to this list. There's a couple of options, but I think this is the one that always stood out to me as being one of his best songs, and the intro is such a powerful statement of a Stratocaster's tone that it just had to be on this list. Now, no list of great Strat players is complete without the man who popularised it over here in the UK at least, Mr. Hank Marvin, when he was in The Shadows. This is really the signature Strat tone for a lot of people to this day. There's no way of accurately replicating the tone and performance on the original, as many strive to do, but I gave it my best, and I think it just sums up what's great about a classic 60s Strat tone in all its glory. So here's one of those slightly anonymous riffs that not everybody might know was necessarily played on a Strat, but when you hear it played on the bridge pickup of a Strat, it all comes together, it all makes sense. One of the greatest bands of all time. They certainly had a lot of textural parts and textural guitar tones in a lot of their songs, but this one is really led by the signature Strat tone, and it's one of the greatest of all time, and that's why it's on the list. So here's a riff that a lot of people will recognise but will not necessarily attribute back to the man who wrote it. Back in the mid-60s, Dick Dale was the guy who was pushing out the Strat as the leader of a band's sound, using incredibly heavy strings, really loud high wattage amplifiers and tons of spring reverb. This great riff was born and has stood the test of time to make it on this list. So here's another of Stevie's great opening lines to one of his fantastic title tracks from his first album, in fact. Didn't quite make the top 10 cut, but to me this is the perfect example of his great blues-driven Strat tone of the early 80s. Obviously he had a bunch of different tones, a bunch of great licks, but this one stood out to me and is certainly the riff that I really fell in love with Stevie when I first heard it. So here we are, folks, we've landed at number one, the most important, the most fantastic, the most arguably irritating to some people, but I would say the ultimate Stratocaster riff of all time, no question. I think this riff gets a bad rap. Obviously, everybody knows it, everybody plays it. It's actually the first thing I ever learned to play on guitar, and I played it incessantly, played it over and over again, and annoyed the hell out of everyone around me. But that doesn't take away from the fact that at its time, it was just the perfect embodiment of Deep Purple's sound. Ritchie Blackmore is an absolute king of creating monstrously heavy riffs, this time with just 2 strings. And even though everybody knows it, and like I said, it does tend to get on people's nerves, especially here in guitar shops, it's just, there's no arguing the fact that it is probably the best guitar riff ever written. It takes a lot of concentration to play it correctly with the same amount of ferocity and intensity that Ritchie did. But I think that when you do, it doesn't come across as cheesy in any way. It's just a great solid rock riff. And I might add that it's probably one of the best sounding Strat solos as well, but most people don't make it that far into the song. So there we are, folks. That is the Peach Guitars top 10 Strat riffs of all time, plus a few considerable honourable mentions in there as well. But I'd very much like to know what your thoughts are. Let me know down in the comments below whether you think we nailed the list, whether there's stuff that we just was glaringly obvious and we missed it. Maybe there was some stuff in this list that you thought had no chance of making the list. Whatever your thoughts are, let me know them down in the comments below. Now I will just say, as I mentioned earlier on, these are just our takes on the top 10 Strat riffs, and you'll notice several glaring omissions from the history of Strat solos and legendary moments. You know, there's no Dave Gilmour on this list, there's no Jeff Beck on this list, several other seminal guitar players that are legendary Strat players that didn't make the cut. But like I said, the context of this really is about the riff, the driving rhythmic powerhouse of a song, in my opinion. However, if you think I've just been completely wrong and blown this whole thing, let me know down in the comments who you think should have made the cut. If you'd like any more information about any of the products that I've used in this video here today, including any of these 3 wonderfully stunning Fender Custom Shop Strats, then click the link in the description box down below to head to our website peachguitars.com, where you can check out not only these guitars, but also the full range of Fender products that we're very pleased to carry. So thank you very much as always for watching, folks. If you enjoyed it, please remember to leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and go back and watch our top 10 Les Paul riffs as well if you've missed that video. So thank you very much as always for watching. Be sure to leave a like down below if you've enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button if you're new here, and if you haven't seen it already, you can go and check out our top 10 Les Paul riffs of all time video as well. So take care of yourselves, folks. I'll see you next time.